This week, the Senate passed a foreign aid bill that would provide funds to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, but it appears dead on arrival in the House of Representatives. But that hasn't stopped Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell from continuing to push it and urging House Republicans to take up the measure. Joining me to talk about his interview with the Senate Minority Leader this week is Alexander Bolton. He's a senior staff writer for TheHill.com, and he talked to Leader McConnell about the foreign aid package, as well as his future as the head of the Republicans in the Senate. Alexander, thank you for joining me on the DC Debrief.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on your show.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. And I know that with Senator McConnell, this is a personal issue from reading your story on the Hill. And listen, I mean, he goes back a long ways. He's a longtime old school. He's not a MAGA Republican senator. And so he obviously has a view of America's place in the world differently than, say, the J.D. Vances of the world and some of the other Republican senators who are more closely aligned with President Trump. So it sounded from your interview that he is really pushing full force against the notion from the Trump camp that aid to Ukraine is something that the U.S. doesn't need to do. What did he have to say to you about that?
Well, he made some interesting points to me, and he revealed some personal history to me, that his father was a foot soldier in George Patton's army and came face to face with the Soviet Union's Red Army in Czechoslovakia after World War II. And McConnell still has the letters that his dad wrote to his mom saying the Russians are going to be a problem. And he talked about the history of the Republican Party going back to when Robert Taft was the most prominent Republican in Washington, senator from Ohio. And he ended up running for president in 1952, lost to Dwight Eisenhower, who became president. That was a significant turning point for the Republican Party. Taft opposed the creation of NATO, and McConnell's argument to me was, we won the Cold War. NATO worked. Eisenhower worked. Eisenhower was right, and basically he's framing himself as a Republican in the tradition of Dwight Eisenhower, of Ronald Reagan, of Teddy Roosevelt, of George H.W. Bush, who believes in the necessity of America projecting power abroad. And Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, those others you mentioned, they're more in the Robert Taft school of isolationism. He pointed out that Robert Taft opposed the Lend-Lease Act. I mean, if you know anything about World War II, that was instrumental. That gave President Franklin Roosevelt, the authority at the time to give weapons, to food, tanks, airplanes to the British. That was pivotal to beating Nazi Germany. And McConnell sees parallels between today's fight against Russia and what happened in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And he says, compared to the Cold War, things are more dangerous for America because not only do you have Russia threatening our interests, but you also have China. And his argument for weeks to his colleagues have been, if you abandon Ukraine to Russia, then you are giving a green light to China with regards to Taiwan. And of course, we have a lot of semiconductor production in Taiwan. It's very important to our economy, to our military, with all our smart weapons. So to give China a green light with regards to Taiwan is a strategic blunder. That's the way he sees it. So he acknowledges that former President Trump is on the other side of this, and so are most Republican voters if you look at the polls. But he said to me, every once in a while, you run into an issue where you just have to do what you believe is right. And he believes the right thing here is to support Ukraine, contain Russian aggression.
Right, because he understands the lay of the land, the popularity of Donald Trump, the popularity of Trump's ideas on this within the Republican Party. Does it seem like he is knowingly fighting a losing battle and that he's okay with that?
Well, I think he believes that if Johnson were to put the Ukraine funding bill, which also funds Israel and the Indo-Pacific region, deterring Chinese aggression, it would also fund the U.S. military fighting off these missile attacks by Houthis against shipping in the Red Sea. I mean, it addresses a variety of national security concerns. McConnell is convinced that if Johnson were to put this Senate passed bill on the House floor, it would pass with a large margin. Now, the hang up here is that would it get a majority of House Republican votes? No, probably not. So it does have minority support within the Republican Party, but it does have majority support in the Congress. And the other thing that McConnell said to me is that he believes that, if it weren't for Trump and the political risks of voting for this and getting crosswise with Trump, he thinks more Republicans would vote for this, and that really there is essentially just a reluctance by colleagues in the Senate and the House, Republican colleagues, to risk getting beat up on, pummeled by Donald Trump. And so, I think he's not giving up on this. And, in your intro, you said that this thing doesn't have any chance of passing the House. That's not the way McConnell sees it. He thinks it can get passed in the House. But what Speaker Mike Johnson's going to do is a real mystery.
Yeah, it certainly sounds from at least Speaker Johnson like he's still insisting that border security be attached to any kind of foreign aid bill. And I'm not sure, if it's the Senate deal on immigration blew up last week, obviously, again, with President Trump signaling to his supporters not to support it. But looking at his comments this weekend about U.S. support for NATO and NATO countries and coming to their support in case of a Russian attack, and NATO countries paying their fair share. I know that for a number of Republicans like McConnell and of his ilk, the idea of not going to defend your allies is something that many Republicans like that have an issue with. But that's not necessarily the same way that other Republicans feel in the party about that particular issue. Did he get into that at all about the issue, the importance of this funding, not just being necessarily a handout to Ukraine, but as being in America's interest, and knowing that somewhere down the line, if the United States enters into a conflict, we're going to want support and help from the very NATO countries and other Western allies that we are seeking to aid at this point right now.
Well, McConnell was asked by another publication about Trump's comments regarding NATO and Trump's off the cuff, somewhat disjointed remarks, really saying that he'd let Russia have their ways with countries that don't pay their NATO dues. I mean, I think Republicans on the Hill didn't take that comment all that seriously. It was made at a rally. It was off the cuff. Whether that would be Trump administration policy, it probably wouldn't be. I mean, let's be real. But as far as NATO goes, I think that what McConnell is pushing, and others in the Republican Party and Democratic Party are pushing, is that the security we provide to our NATO allies. Yes, we're doing all the spending and heavy lifting, and we have all the weapons and material, but it also accrues to our benefit because having allies, we're able to wield significant, trade influence, economic influence, and other influence over those countries. NATO creates a sphere of American hegemony and influence that spreads throughout Europe. So let's think about it. What caused this war in the first place in Ukraine? Well, Vladimir Putin was worried about Ukraine getting too close to the Europeans, that they might someday end up in NATO. That is very critical to him. Why is he worried about that? Because Ukraine and NATO is good for the United States. It increases our economic power, our diplomatic power, our influence. And, the economic argument is a tough one for, I think, people who are busy with their daily lives and putting food on the table and buying gas and all that stuff. But, it was something that McConnell has addressed on the floor before, which is we accrue huge benefits from our relations with Europe. I mean, the European Union has more people than the United States. I mean, it has an economy on par with the United States. To let Russia threaten those marketplaces really threatens our economic interests here at home, and it threatens our ability to engage and open up markets around the world. We're the richest country in the world. And why is that? Because we can sell to international markets. How do we sell to international markets? Because they follow the rule of law, because they follow our intellectual property rules, because they follow our the regulations that are necessary for American companies to do business over there. Those markets get shut out to us, then we are in a dire economic situation. We're seeing recession. I mean, you cannot underestimate the importance of international markets to American prosperity at home. And that is really what this is all about. And it's a difficult argument to make because it's highly complex and it's highly theoretical, but that is a big part of what this debate is all about.
When you spoke to McConnell, did he seem affected at all? By the border security deal blowing up, by the fact that they had to strip it from the foreign aid package, the seeming resistance by Republicans in the House? Is he at all worried that his political capital as the at one time de facto leader of the party, is he concerned at all that his GOP, that his capital within inside the party is waning at all? Is that, and does he believe that that's true?
Well, there have been stories written in the last couple of weeks because there's been such sharp criticism of him by his usual critics in the Senate Republican Conference, people like Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, um, you know, calling for him to step down as Republican leader. I mean, this border security deal was something that he tapped Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma to negotiate. It wound up getting only 4 Republican votes on the floor. So that was a setback. That was embarrassing. But it's all part of the process. And I think when I sat down with McConnell, he seemed very comfortable, relaxed. He seemed genuinely pleased that this vote for Ukraine funding got 22 Republican votes, including McConnell's vote. For McConnell, it was all about Ukraine funding. And as he's told reporters and told us, the only reason he decided to add this border security deal to it is because Republicans demanded that there be border provisions. So then when the party then changed its mind and said, well, we don't want border part of it as part of this deal, he was fine with pulling that off. He never really, that was never what this was about for him. For him, it was about getting that Ukraine funding passed. That's what he thinks is so critical. So I asked him directly, do you think your influence in the party is diminishing? I asked him point blank. And he said, well, people who say that forget about the times I voted to, raise the debt ceiling and to keep the government funded. And going back, looking at the record in 2014, I think he was only one of maybe 14 Republicans to vote to raise the debt ceiling. And then again in 2021, he's one of just a handful of Republicans to vote to raise the debt ceiling in 2021. So the way he put it to me is, these are issues where most Republicans, they don't want to raise the debt ceiling, they don't want to fund government, but we got to do it. And
Yeah.
he's just acknowledging the political realities that a party, Republicans can grandstand on the debt limit and government funding and even Ukraine funding, but at the end of the day, someone has to take the tough votes to basically, protect the country. And that's the way McConnell sees it. And I know that if Ted Cruz were on this program, he would have some very articulate, counterpoint here, but he's not.
Right. Yeah. Maybe one day we'll get him on. And of course, that government funding, keeping the doors open, that deadline is rapidly approaching as well. Last thing for you, we've heard a lot about the senator's health, some of the issues that he has had, and I'm just curious, how did you find him to be health-wise when you were speaking to him?
I didn't see any physical trace or hint of that fall. He suffered in March of last year. He suffered a concussion and a fractured rib after he fell at a private event at the Waldorf Astoria. It was March, almost a year ago. He missed weeks and weeks of time. He was away from the Capitol. He was in rehab. And he had those, a couple of those incidents last year where he froze up before cameras. But, he really seems to have regained his strength. He does turn 82 years old on, I think it's February 20th. So, anyone who has older parents or grandparents, they know that when you get up to your 80s, you just don't have the physical strength that you used to. And, he is certainly getting older. But as far as his health, it seems very good to me. He was, relaxed, energetic, and talking to his staff, they feel that he has really made a comeback here. So, I personally think he's going to remain leader through 2026. I think Republicans are going to win back the Senate in the fall, and I think that McConnell's term lasts until the end of 2026. I think he will remain as leader. Of course, there are some caveats there. That's my prediction, but
Yeah.
it also depends on events. Now,
Yeah.
if Republicans fail to win back the Senate majority, despite how favorable the map is, that'd be problematic for him. I think he would face another, renewed leadership challenge. And then again, if Trump is elected president, Trump has made it clear he doesn't like McConnell. He wants McConnell out of that
Mhm.
job. Um, you know, would he be able to do that if he were president? Well, I think if McConnell wins back the Senate majority, he can say, "Hey, I got us to the promised land, so I deserve 2 more years." And I think most of his colleagues would agree with that. So I think that unless Republicans, have another disaster at the polls this year, um, if they do win back the Senate, I think he stays on as leader through 2026.
Well, it's a really good interview. A lot of good information in there, and we will have a link to the interview in the YouTube section, the description area of the YouTube video here. So if people want to check it out, they can go do that, and they can also go to thehill.com and read all of Alexander Bolton's terrific stuff there. Alexander, thank you for joining me on the DC Debrief.
Thanks for having me on.